Hello, dear friend. Come, sit with me for a while. I want to tell you a story. A true story about a woman named Margaret, about words that nearly broke her, and about the beautiful way she proved those words wrong. This isn't a story about revenge. It's quieter than that. It's about something more powerful. It's about a woman who was told her time had passed, who almost believed it, and who chose to live anyway, chose to love anyway, chose to bloom anyway. If you've ever been told you're too old, too much, too late, this story is for you. If you've ever looked in the mirror and wondered if your best days are behind you, this story is for you. If you've ever felt invisible, dismissed, or discarded because of the number of years you've lived, oh my dear, this story is especially for you. So settle in, pour yourself some tea, get comfortable. Because Margaret's story takes time to tell properly, and some stories, the important ones, should never be rushed. Let's begin where all the best transformations begin, with an ending. Margaret Collins was 52 years old when someone told her she was too old for love. But to understand why those words devastated her so completely, you need to understand who she was before she heard them. Margaret lived in a butter yellow house on Maple Street, the kind of house that looks like it should have children running through it. Screen doors slamming, laughter echoing from the kitchen. And once it had been exactly that kind of house. Margaret and her husband Robert had raised two daughters there, Emma and Sophie, filling every room with life and noise and joy. But Robert had been gone for 7 years now. A heart attack at 53, sudden and cruel, leaving Margaret alone in a house that suddenly felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories. Her daughters had grown, as daughters do. Emma lived in Seattle with her husband and two young boys. Sophie was in Boston, building her career as a physical therapist, too busy for more than weekly phone calls. They loved their mother, of course they did, but they had lives of their own now. As they should. Margaret understood this. She never complained. She filled her days with purpose. She volunteered at the library on Tuesdays, tended her garden, took long walks through the neighborhood she'd lived in for 30 years. She video called her grandsons every Sunday, making them laugh with silly faces and knock-knock jokes. To anyone watching, Margaret was fine, adjusted, moving forward. But here's what no one saw. The way she held her breath when she unlocked her front door each evening, bracing for the silence that would greet her. The way she sometimes set 2 plates on the table before remembering, catching herself, putting one back. The way she watched couples walking hand in hand through the park and felt something twist in her chest. Not quite jealousy, not quite grief, but something closer to loneliness so deep it had become part of her landscape. She missed being touched. Not sexually, though yes, that too. But just touched. A hand on her shoulder. Someone moving her hair from her face. The casual intimacy of being known by another person, of sharing space and breath and ordinary moments. Margaret had loved being married. She'd loved being a wife, a partner, someone's favorite person. And in the 7 years since Robert's death, she'd convinced herself that part of her life was over. That chapter had closed. At 52, she should be grateful for what she'd had and accept what she had now. Solitude, memories, and the quiet dignity of growing old alone. She almost succeeded in accepting it. Almost. 6 months before the words that would change everything, Margaret did something impulsive. Her sister Linda had been nagging her for months to get out more, meet people, try something new. "You're not a nun, Maggie," Linda had said during one of their phone calls. "You're allowed to have a social life." So Margaret joined a book club at the community center. She told herself it was just about books, about having something to do on Thursday evenings besides watch television shows she didn't really care about. She told herself she wasn't looking for anything more than conversation and maybe, if she was lucky, a friend or two. The book club met in a cozy room with overstuffed chairs and dim lighting. There were 8 regular members, mostly women, mostly Margaret's age or older. They read literary fiction and mysteries, drinking wine from plastic cups and arguing cheerfully about characters and themes. Margaret liked it immediately. She liked having opinions again, liked being asked what she thought, liked the way her mind engaged with ideas beyond grocery lists and garden planning. And then, at her third meeting, David walked in. David Patterson, 56, recently moved to town, a high school English teacher looking to meet people who actually read books. He had salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and the kind of warm smile that reached his eyes. When he introduced himself, his voice was soft, cultured, a little uncertain, like he wasn't sure he belonged there but hoped he might. Margaret noticed him, of course, but she didn't think about him that way. Not at first. They started talking after that meeting, just casual conversation about the book they'd discussed. A novel about second chances that had made Margaret cry in her bathtub the night before. David had been moved by it too. They stood in the parking lot for 20 minutes, analyzing the ending, debating whether the protagonist had made the right choice. "I think she was brave," Margaret said. "Starting over at 50-something. That takes courage." David had looked at her thoughtfully. "You think 50-something is too old to start over?" "I think society tells us it is," Margaret replied carefully. "Well," David said, smiling, "society is often wrong." That conversation became a pattern. Every Thursday, after book club, they'd linger in the parking lot, talking. Then they started arriving early, grabbing coffee at the cafe next door before the meeting. Then David asked if she'd like to take a walk through the park on Saturday just to discuss the next book. Margaret said yes. The walks became regular. Saturday mornings, they'd meet at the park entrance, walk the 2-mile loop, talking about books and then gradually about other things. David's divorce 5 years ago. Margaret's widowhood, his teenage daughter who lived with his ex-wife. Her daughters who called but rarely visited. They talked about loneliness, about houses that felt too quiet, about wondering if this was all there was left. And Margaret, slowly, carefully began to feel something she thought had died with Robert. Possibility. She began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there could be something more than friendship here. She began to notice the way David's eyes lit up when he saw her, the way he remembered small things she'd mentioned, her favorite flower, her grandson's name, the author she'd been meaning to read. She began to hope. And hope, as anyone who's been lonely knows, is a dangerous, precious thing. Over 3 months, Margaret's friendship with David deepened in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. They started texting. Good morning messages that made Margaret smile over her coffee. Photos of books they thought the other would enjoy. Late-night conversations about nothing and everything. The kind of talks that happen when two people are genuinely interested in each other's thoughts. Margaret found herself thinking about him at odd moments. While weeding her garden, she'd remember something funny he'd said. While grocery shopping, she'd see his favorite tea and almost buy it before catching herself. While falling asleep, she'd replay their conversations, analyzing his words for hidden meaning. Her daughters noticed the change. During their Sunday video call, Sophie said, "Mom, you seem lighter. What's going on?" Margaret had hesitated, then admitted, "I've made a new friend. David. We met at book club." Emma and Sophie exchanged glances on the screen. "A friend?" Emma asked carefully. "Just a friend," Margaret said quickly. Too quickly. "We talk about books. It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. And Margaret knew it. There were moments, small, electric moments, when Margaret was certain David felt it too. The way their hands would brush when reaching for the same book. The way he'd lean in close to hear her in crowded cafes, closer than necessary. The way he'd say her name, Margaret, with a softness that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. Once, sitting on a park bench after a particularly long walk, David had said, "I'm really glad you joined that book club, Margaret. These past few months, you've made everything better." Margaret's heart had hammered. "You've made things better for me, too." They'd sat in silence after that, shoulders almost touching, and Margaret had felt certain he was about to say something more, something important. She'd held her breath, waiting, but David had just smiled and checked his watch. "I should get going. Lots of papers to grade." and the moment had passed, but the hope remained, growing, persistent, undeniable. Margaret started paying more attention to her appearance. She bought a new lipstick, got her hair styled, wore clothes that made her feel attractive instead of invisible. She was 52 years old, and for the first time in 7 years, she felt like a woman instead of just a widow. She felt alive, and she decided to take a chance. The invitation came out casual, almost accidental, during one of their Saturday walks. "David, I was thinking, would you like to come over for dinner this Friday? Nothing fancy, just, it would be nice to cook for someone other than myself." David's face had lit up immediately. "I'd love that. Thank you, Margaret." The week leading up to Friday moved in slow motion. Margaret planned the menu carefully. Chicken marsala, Robert's favorite. No, wait. That felt wrong. She settled on salmon with lemon and herbs, roasted vegetables, a salad with pears and candied walnuts. She bought a nice bottle of wine. She cleaned her house until it sparkled, then cleaned it again. On Friday afternoon, she showered and stood in front of her closet for 20 minutes before choosing a simple navy dress that made her feel elegant. She applied makeup with a careful hand, enough to feel polished, not so much that it looked like she was trying too hard. At 6 o'clock, David arrived with flowers, white roses. "They reminded me of you," he said. "Classic. Beautiful." Margaret's hands trembled as she arranged them in a vase. This was it. This was the night she would tell him how she felt. This was the night everything would change. Dinner was perfect. The salmon was cooked just right, flaky and tender. The wine was crisp and cold. They ate at Margaret's dining room table, the one she'd inherited from her grandmother, with candles flickering between them and soft jazz playing from the speaker in the living room. They talked easily, as they always did. David told her about a difficult student who'd finally had a breakthrough with Shakespeare. Margaret told him about her grandson's latest video call, how the youngest had proudly shown her a drawing of a dinosaur eating a pizza. They laughed. They refilled their wine glasses. They lingered over dessert, a store-bought tiramisu that Margaret had plated to look homemade. As the evening stretched on, Margaret felt her courage building. She would tell him, after dessert, after they moved to the living room. She would tell him that these months had meant something to her, that he had meant something to her, that she was ready to explore whatever this was between them. But as David helped her clear the plates, carrying them to the kitchen with the comfortable ease of someone who felt at home in her space, something in his expression shifted. He became quieter, more serious. Margaret's heart began to pound. This was it. He felt it too. He was going to say something. They stood in her kitchen, the dishes abandoned in the sink, and David turned to her with an expression that looked almost apologetic. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." "Okay," she whispered, her pulse racing. "I've really valued our friendship these past months. You've become one of my favorite people. I look forward to our walks and our conversations more than you know." Margaret smiled, waiting for the but that would turn into something wonderful. Instead, David took a breath and said, "But I need to be honest with you about something. I've started seeing someone." The kitchen tilted. Margaret gripped the counter. "Oh?" "Her name is Emma. She's a colleague at the school. We've been on a few dates, and I think it might become something serious." Margaret's mouth went dry. That's wonderful, David. I'm happy for you." The lie tasted bitter. David smiled, relieved, apparently not noticing the way Margaret's knuckles had turned white against the countertop. "I'm glad you understand," he said. "I was worried about telling you. I didn't want things to be awkward between us. Our friendship means too much to me." Margaret nodded mechanically. "Of course, nothing will change." Everything had already changed. David continued, seemingly unaware of the small devastation occurring in front of him. "Emma's 38, younger than me, I know, but there's this energy with her, this excitement. When we're together, I feel, I don't know, younger myself, like I'm getting a second chance at that kind of passion." Each word was a small cut. Margaret managed to keep her expression neutral. That sounds lovely. It is, David said, warming to his subject. After my divorce, I thought maybe I was done with all that. The butterflies, the staying up all night talking, the intensity of new love. But Emma makes me feel like I'm 30 again. He laughed, oblivious. And then he said the words that would echo in Margaret's mind for months, the words that would nearly break her. I think at our age, Margaret, well, at your age especially, companionship is wonderful. Having someone to talk to share books with, to take walks with. That's valuable. Really valuable. He put his hand on her shoulder, friendly, paternal. But real romance? Real passion? The kind of love that makes your heart race? He shook his head, smiling sadly. I think we're both too old for that kind of love. I mean, you're 52. I'm 56. For me, maybe I've got a few more years to chase that feeling with someone younger. But for you? He trailed off, as if the rest was obvious. As if Margaret should simply accept this assessment of her romantic worth. As if her age had an expiration date stamped across her heart. I think, David continued gently, kindly, like he was doing her a favor, the best thing for people our age, your age, is to find peace with companionship, friendship, maybe even a partnership without all the romantic complications. That's enough, isn't it? At this stage of life? Margaret stared at him. This man she'd almost told she was falling for. This man she'd cooked dinner for, worn a dress for, hoped for. This man who was telling her, with genuine kindness in his eyes, that she was too old for passion, too old for romance, too old for the kind of love that makes your heart race. Not because she was unlovable, but because she was 52. And 52, apparently, was too old for love. Margaret heard herself speaking from very far away. You're probably right, she said. Her voice sounded normal, steady. Companionship is valuable. Exactly, David said, looking relieved. I knew you'd understand. You're so practical, Margaret. So grounded. That's one of the things I admire about you. He checked his watch. I should get going. Early morning tomorrow, but thank you for dinner. It was wonderful. Really wonderful. He hugged her, a friendly, brotherly hug, and headed toward the door. Margaret followed, moving like a woman in a dream. Or a nightmare. At the door, David turned back. We'll still do our Saturday walks, right? I don't want this to change anything. Of course, Margaret said. Nothing has to change. Great, I'll text you. And Margaret, I hope you find that companionship you deserve. You're a special person. Some lucky man would be fortunate to have you as a friend. As a friend. Not as a lover. Not as someone whose heart still raced. Just as a friend. David left, whistling softly as he walked to his car. Margaret closed the door and stood in her hallway, still wearing the navy dress she'd chosen so carefully. The dress she'd thought made her look attractive. The dress she'd hoped would make him see her as a woman, not just a widow, not just a friend. The candles were still burning in the dining room. The jazz was still playing. The white roses he'd brought, they reminded me of you, beautiful, were still sitting in the vase on her kitchen counter. Margaret looked down at her hands. 52-year-old hands. Hands that had held babies and buried a husband and baked 1,000 cookies and planted gardens and wiped tears. Hands that were apparently too old to hold romance. She walked to the mirror in the hallway and looked at herself. Really looked. And saw suddenly what David must have seen. A 52-year-old woman. Not young. Not exciting. Not worthy of passion. Just old. Too old for love. Margaret moved through her house like a ghost. She blew out the candles, turned off the music, wrapped the leftover salmon in foil and put it in the refrigerator, knowing she wouldn't eat it. She washed the dishes slowly, carefully, focusing on the rhythm of soap and water, because if she focused on that, she wouldn't have to think about anything else. But when the kitchen was clean and there was nothing left to do, the thoughts came anyway. Too old for love. Margaret walked upstairs to her bedroom, the bedroom she'd shared with Robert, though she'd changed everything after he died, unable to sleep in the same sheets, look at the same walls. She sat on the edge of her bed and caught her reflection in the dresser mirror. She studied her face with a cruelty she'd never applied before. The lines around her eyes. Crow's feet, people called them politely. Wrinkles, really. Signs of age. The softness of her jawline. Not firm like it used to be. The gray in her hair. She'd been coloring it for years, but roots showed. Silver threads she'd thought looked distinguished. Now they just looked old. Her neck. When had her neck started looking like this? Her hands again. Age spots she'd barely noticed before. Now they seemed to glow in accusation. She was 52 years old. She looked 52 years old. And according to David, kind, thoughtful David, who'd never meant to be cruel, that meant she was too old for the kind of love that mattered. The exciting kind. The passionate kind. The kind that made life feel worth living. Margaret thought about Robert. He'd loved her at 45, had looked at her with desire and tenderness until the day he died. But Robert was gone. And apparently no one else would ever look at her that way again. She thought about her daughters, building lives in distant cities. She thought about her grandsons who loved her but saw her as grandma. Sweet, soft, old. She thought about her friends, most of them married or contentedly single or past the point of caring. She thought about the rest of her life. Decades, probably. Maybe 30 years. 40 if she was unlucky. Decades of this. Being too old. Being invisible. Being dismissed. Being someone men like David had pleasant conversations with, but never looked at as a woman. As someone desirable. As someone who deserved passion. Margaret lay down on her bed, still in the navy dress, and stared at the ceiling. She didn't cry. The hurt was too deep for tears. She just lay there, in the dark, feeling something inside her close up. Feeling herself accept what David had said. What the world had been telling her, in small ways, for years. She was too old for love. And she would have to learn to live with that. The Saturday after the dinner, David texted as if nothing had happened. "Still on for our walk?" Margaret stared at the message for a long time before responding. Of course. She met him at the park as usual. She smiled as usual. They talked about the book they were reading as usual. David told her about his date with Emma. They'd gone to a concert, she loved live music, it had been magical. Margaret nodded and said all the right things. That sounds wonderful. I'm so happy for you. She sounds lovely. And she meant it in a way. She genuinely didn't wish David unhappiness. She just wished she could stop hurting. The book club continued. Margaret still went every Thursday. She sat across the room from David now instead of next to him. She participated in discussions and drank her wine and laughed at appropriate moments. But something had broken inside her. She stopped wearing makeup to the meetings. What was the point? She stopped checking her phone hopefully. No one was texting who mattered. She stopped imagining futures that included romance or passion or being seen as a woman instead of just a friendly middle-aged person. Her daughters called for their weekly check-ins. How are you, Mom? I'm fine, sweetie. How are the boys? She was good at this. She'd been a mother for 30 years. She knew how to focus conversations on her children, deflect questions about herself, present a cheerful front no matter what was happening beneath it. Emma and Sophie heard nothing wrong in her voice. Why would they? Margaret sounded exactly like she always sounded. Calm, interested in their lives, content with her own. No one knew that she'd started going to bed at 8:30 because there was no reason to stay awake. No one knew that she'd stopped listening to music because every song seemed to be about love, and it all felt like mockery. No one knew that she sometimes stood in front of her bathroom mirror, studying her reflection with something close to hatred, wondering what was wrong with her that she'd ever thought someone could want her at 52. David had moved on easily. He was happy. In love. And Margaret was learning what she should have accepted years ago. Some things are simply over. Some doors close and don't reopen. Love, for her, was one of those doors. She needed to accept it. She was trying to accept it. She just didn't know how to stop hurting. 3 weeks after the dinner that changed everything, Margaret's sister Linda showed up unannounced. Linda was 50, 2 years younger than Margaret, with the same dark eyes but a wildness Margaret had never possessed. Linda had divorced young, raised her kids alone, and married Thomas at 49 after swearing she'd never marry again. She lived her life loudly, passionately, without apology. She took one look at Margaret and said, "What happened?" "Nothing happened. I'm fine." Bullshit. Linda walked into the kitchen, found the kettle, filled it with water. "You look like someone died. Talk to me." Margaret tried to deflect. She was good at deflecting, but Linda was better at persistence. Finally, sitting at the kitchen table with tea neither of them was drinking, Margaret told her. About David, about the months of friendship, about the hope she'd allowed herself to feel, about the dinner and the confession and the words that kept echoing in her mind. "He said I'm too old for love," Margaret whispered. "Not companionship, not friendship, but real love, passion, romance. He said at my age, at 52, I should accept that part of life is over." Linda's expression went from concerned to furious in seconds. "He said what?" "He didn't mean it cruelly," Margaret said quickly, defending David even now. "He was just being honest. And maybe he's right. Maybe I am too old. Look at me, Linda. I'm 52. I have gray hair and wrinkles and—" "Stop." Linda's voice was sharp. "Stop right now." She reached across the table and grabbed Margaret's hands. "Listen to me, Maggie. You are 52 years old. Not 92, not dead. 52? Do you know what that is? That's young. That's vibrant. That's alive." "Linda, I met Thomas when I was 49. Linda interrupted. 49? I'd been alone for 20 years. I'd convinced myself I was done with love, that I'd had my chance and it was over. And then I met Thomas at a stupid work conference, and he looked at me like I was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Do you know what he said on our first date?" Margaret shook her head. "He said, 'I can't believe I found you. I can't believe I get to start over at 53. He was older than me, Maggie. Older than you are now. And he wasn't looking for companionship. He was looking for love, real love, the kind that makes your heart race." Linda squeezed Margaret's hands harder. "That man, David, is an idiot. And worse, he's wrong. You are not too old for anything. The right person doesn't care about age. The right person sees you, the whole you, and they want all of it." "But what if there is no right person?" Margaret's voice broke. "What if David's right and I'm just supposed to accept being alone?" "Then you accept being alone because you choose it," Linda said fiercely. "Not because some man who doesn't deserve you decided you're past your expiration date. Maggie, you're not expired. You're not done. You're just waiting for someone who isn't a complete moron." Despite everything, Margaret laughed. It was a small laugh, watery and weak, but it was real. Linda smiled. "There she is. There's my sister." After Linda left, promising to call every day until Margaret stopped looking like a sad ghost, Margaret sat alone in her living room. She thought about Linda's words, about Thomas, who'd fallen in love at 53, about the fierce certainty in her sister's voice when she'd said, "You're not expired." Margaret got up and walked to the bookshelf where she kept her photo albums. She pulled out the ones from her marriage, from her daughter's childhoods, from various stages of her life. There she was at 23 on her wedding day. Young, hopeful, radiant. There she was at 30, holding newborn Emma. Tired but glowing. There she was at 40, at Sophie's high school graduation. Confident, proud, beautiful. There she was at 45, dancing with Robert at Emma's wedding. Happy, so happy. Alive in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with love. Robert had been 50 when that photo was taken. He'd still desired her, still looked at her like she was everything, because age hadn't mattered to him. Love had mattered. Margaret studied each photo, trying to see herself the way she'd seen herself then, not as old or young, just as herself, as a woman who'd lived and loved and deserved to keep living and loving. She thought about David's words again, but this time they sounded different. Not like truth, but like one man's limited opinion. One man's fear of aging dressed up as wisdom. David was wrong. Maybe he was wrong. What if he was wrong? The thought was small, tentative, like a green shoot pushing through frozen ground. But it was there. Margaret closed the photo albums and looked around her house. The house where she'd been hiding. The house where she'd been waiting to be chosen instead of choosing herself. She thought about what Linda had said. If you're alone, let it be because you choose it. When had Margaret last chosen anything for herself? When had she last done something brave? When had she last treated herself like she mattered? The answer shamed her. Not in years, but she could start. She could start right now. The next morning, Margaret woke up and did something she hadn't done in 7 years. She made a decision based entirely on what would make her happy. There was a watercolor painting class she'd been wanting to take for months. She'd seen the flyers at the community center, had even picked one up once before putting it back down. Too expensive, too frivolous, too self-indulgent for a widow who should be focusing on practical things. But that morning, Margaret went online and registered for the class. 8 weeks, every Tuesday and Thursday evening. $200 she absolutely could afford but had convinced herself she shouldn't spend. She paid for it before she could talk herself out of it. Then she drove to the art supply store and bought everything on the class materials list. Watercolor paints, brushes, paper, a palette, a water container. She spent another $100 without flinching. When she got home, she arranged her new supplies on the kitchen table and just looked at them. Bright tubes of paint, clean brushes, pristine white paper waiting to be transformed. She wasn't taking this class to meet anyone. She wasn't doing it to prove anything to David. She wasn't even doing it to heal, necessarily. She was doing it because she wanted to. Because somewhere inside her, beneath all the hurt and shame and fear, there was still a woman who wanted things, who had desires, who deserved to pursue them. Margaret touched the tubes of paint. Cerulean blue, cadmium yellow, alizarin crimson, and felt something shift. It was the smallest beginning. But it was a beginning. The first night of watercolor class, Margaret almost didn't go. She stood in front of her closet for 15 minutes, suddenly terrified. What if she was terrible at painting? What if everyone else was younger, more talented, more confident? What if this was just another reminder that she was too old to start new things? But she thought about the $200 she'd spent, about the promise she'd made to herself, about Linda's voice saying, "Choose yourself." So she went. The art studio was in an old converted warehouse with huge windows and exposed brick walls. The light was beautiful, golden and soft. About 12 easels were set up in a semicircle, each with a stool and a small table for supplies. Margaret arrived early, chose an easel near the back, and carefully unpacked her new materials, trying to look like she knew what she was doing. Other students filtered in. Margaret had been right. Most were younger than her. But not all. There was a woman who looked to be in her late 60s, moving slowly but with purpose. There was a man around Margaret's age, setting up his supplies with nervous precision. And then the instructor arrived. Grace Chen was probably 65, with silver hair cut in a sleek bob and paint stains on her jeans. She had the kind of presence that filled a room. Confident, warm, entirely comfortable in her skin. "Welcome, everyone," Grace said, her voice carrying easily. "I'm thrilled to have you here. Some of you have painted before, some of you haven't. None of that matters. What matters is that you're here, you're willing to try, and you're ready to play." Play. Margaret liked that word. For the first hour, Grace taught them basic techniques. How to wet the paper, how to mix colors, How to let the paint flow and blend instead of trying to control every stroke. Watercolor teaches you to let go, Grace said, demonstrating a wash that bloomed across the paper in unpredictable beauty. You can guide it, but you can't force it. The moment you try to control it completely, it rebels. You have to learn to work with it, not against it. Margaret found herself relaxing into the rhythm, dipping her brush in water, loading it with paint, touching it to paper, and watching colors spread and mingle. It was meditative, calming. For 2 hours, she didn't think about David or age or loneliness. She just painted. Her first attempt at a simple landscape, a sunset over hills, was objectively terrible. The colors bled together into a muddy purple-brown. The hills looked like lumpy potatoes. But she'd made it. She'd created something that hadn't existed before. And for the first time in weeks, Margaret felt something other than sadness. She felt curious, engaged, present. She felt alive. After class, Grace invited everyone to stay for coffee in the studio's small cafe area. Get to know each other, she encouraged. Artists need community. Margaret hesitated, then stayed. The older woman Margaret had noticed introduced herself as Patricia. I'm 68, she said matter-of-factly, and I just started painting 6 months ago. My husband died last year, and I was going absolutely crazy sitting at home. So I thought, what the hell, right? Might as well try something new before I die. She laughed, and Margaret found herself laughing too. I'm Margaret, 52, widow as well, 7 years. Oh, honey, Patricia said, touching her arm. 7 years alone? You're a saint. I made it 6 months before I needed to get out of the house or risk becoming one of those women who talks to her cat. I talk to my plants, Margaret admitted. That's actually healthy, a male voice said. The nervous man from class had joined them. I'm James. I talk to my plants too. Supposedly it helps them grow, though mine all died anyway, so. He shrugged, smiling self-deprecatingly. Margaret liked him immediately. Over the next hour, sitting in mismatched chairs with lukewarm coffee, Margaret learned about her new classmates. James was 55, an accountant who'd always wanted to be an artist but had been told it was impractical. His wife had divorced him 3 years ago, saying he was too boring. He'd decided, boring or not, he was going to pursue his dreams. Patricia had been a nurse for 40 years. She'd spent her whole life taking care of others and had no idea who she was when she was alone. She was, she said, figuring it out one painting at a time. There was Teresa, 47, a single mother whose kids had just left for college. There was Darren, 32, recovering from a breakup. There was Lily, 70, who'd painted her whole life and just loved sharing it with new people. They were all different ages, different backgrounds, different reasons for being there. But they all had one thing in common. They'd chosen to try something new, to start something, to believe they deserved creativity and community and joy. Margaret realized, sitting among these strangers who were already beginning to feel like friends, that she'd spent months orbiting David's attention. These people simply enjoyed her company. No qualifiers, no judgments about age, just acceptance. Over the following weeks, Margaret and James developed an easy friendship. They both tended to arrive 15 minutes early to class. They'd help each other set up easels, discuss what they wanted to paint that day, share the YouTube tutorials they'd watched trying to improve. James had a dry, clever sense of humor that caught Margaret off guard. He'd look at his painting, always slightly wonky, always earnest in its imperfection, and say things like, I think I've captured the essence of a drunk tree, or, this sunset looks like it's having an allergic reaction. Margaret would laugh until tears came to her eyes. She'd forgotten how good it felt to laugh. One Thursday evening, as they cleaned brushes side by side at the studio sink, James mentioned his divorce. My ex-wife, Sharon, she said I was boring, he said, scrubbing blue paint from his hands. Too predictable, too stable. She wanted excitement, adventure, someone who made her feel young. Margaret's hands stilled in the soapy water. She left me for her personal trainer, James continued. 29 years old, lots of energy. Very exciting, apparently. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. I spent a year thinking she was right, that I was boring, that I'd failed somehow by being myself. You're not boring, Margaret said quietly. How do you know? You barely know me. I know you think about things deeply. I know you notice details. I know you're kind and funny and genuine. Those aren't boring qualities. Those are good qualities. James looked at her, really looked, and Margaret felt something flutter in her chest. Someone once told me I was too old for love, she heard herself say. Too old for passion or romance. That at my age I should settle for companionship. James's expression shifted to genuine confusion. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Margaret laughed, surprised. That's what my sister said. Your sister's smart. James dried his hands on a towel. Margaret, I don't know who told you that, but they were wrong. And also probably an idiot. They stood there for a moment, just looking at each other, and Margaret felt something she hadn't felt since before the dinner with David. She felt seen, not despite her age, not with qualifications or caveats, just seen. As a person, as a woman, as someone worth knowing. Walking to her car that night, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from David. Haven't seen you much lately? Everything okay? She looked at the message for a long moment, then replied simply, Everything's fine. Just busy. And it was true. She was busy. She was busy painting and laughing and making friends. She was busy choosing herself. She was busy remembering who she was beyond someone's potential love interest, beyond a widow, beyond a woman whose value was determined by whether a man desired her. Margaret realized, standing in the parking lot under streetlights, that she hadn't thought about David in days. Not with longing, anyway. Sometimes with pity, sometimes with gratitude that things hadn't worked out, but not with the desperate hurt that had consumed her for weeks. She thought about James instead, about the way he listened when she talked, about how he made her laugh, about the gentle way he'd said, they were wrong. She wasn't ready to call it attraction. Not yet. Maybe it was just friendship. Maybe that's all it would ever be. But for the first time in months, Margaret felt like maybe, just maybe, there was more to her life than loneliness. She felt like maybe she was healing. She felt like maybe David had been wrong about everything, including her. Especially her. Margaret drove home with the windows down, letting the spring air rush through her car, and she felt something she'd thought was gone forever. She felt hope. As spring deepened into early summer, Margaret and James's friendship expanded beyond the studio walls. It started with a simple suggestion. James had read about a watercolor exhibit at the City Museum, works by contemporary artists exploring landscapes. Would you want to go see it? He'd asked. Saturday afternoon? We could study their techniques? Margaret had said yes without hesitation. The museum was quiet that Saturday, filled with the kind of respectful silence that comes from people genuinely absorbed in art. They moved slowly through the exhibit, standing before each painting for long minutes, discussing brushwork and color choices and emotional impact. Look at how she captured light on water, Margaret whispered, pointing to a piece that made the ocean seem alive and moving. It's all about leaving white space, James observed. See how the unpainted paper becomes the light? That's mastery. They could have been talking about anything. The weather, groceries, nothing. But they weren't. They were talking about beauty, about craft, about things that mattered to both of them. After the museum, they found a cafe nearby. Over coffee that turned into lunch that turned into 2 hours of conversation, they talked about their lives beyond art. James told her about growing up in Maine, in a small coastal town where everyone knew everyone. About his father, a fisherman, who'd been skeptical when James chose accounting over the family business. About his daughter, now 23, who was backpacking through Europe and called him once a month, full of stories. Margaret told him about her years teaching elementary school before Emma was born, and how she loved the chaos of 25 6-year-olds all needing her attention at once. About Robert, carefully, the way she'd learned to talk about him, with love but not grief that would make others uncomfortable. About her grandsons, who she adored but missed terribly. Do you ever feel invisible? James asked suddenly. Like the world decided you're not relevant anymore? Margaret's breath caught. Yes, all the time. Sharon made me feel like that, James admitted. Like at 52, I was already obsolete, already boring and predictable and not worth the effort. I started believing her. Someone made me feel like that too, Margaret said softly. Told me I was too old for certain kinds of love. That passion wasn't for people our age. James looked genuinely angry. What kind of person says that? Someone who believes it themselves, Margaret said, and realized it was true. David had been running from his own aging, his own fear. His words about her had really been about himself. Well, they're wrong, James said firmly. Age doesn't kill passion or relevance or love. Fear does. Giving up does. But not age itself. He reached across the table and took her hand. Just held it. Casual and warm and entirely natural. Margaret, I really enjoy spending time with you. These past weeks, you've made everything better. More interesting. More fun. Just more. Margaret looked at their joined hands. 52-year-old hands and 55-year-old hands. Hands with age spots and wrinkles and years of life written across them. Beautiful hands. Hands that fit together perfectly. You've made things better for me too, she whispered. And she meant it more than she'd meant anything in a long time. 3 weeks later, James invited Margaret to a gallery opening. A local artist was showing a series of watercolor abstracts, and Grace had mentioned it in class. We should support local artists, James had said, then added almost shyly, would you like to go? Together? On Friday evening? It felt different from their museum visit, more intentional, more like a date. Margaret wore a green dress she hadn't touched in years. She put on lipstick. She looked in the mirror and, for the first time in months, didn't search her reflection for signs of aging. She just saw herself and thought she looked nice. James picked her up at 7. When she opened the door, his expression made her heart skip. You look beautiful, he said simply. Not nice, not great. Beautiful. The gallery was crowded, filled with people holding wine glasses and discussing art with varying degrees of genuine interest. James got them each a glass of white wine, and they navigated through the crowd, pausing before paintings that caught their attention. The room was packed. People pressed close together. At one point, James placed his hand on the small of Margaret's back to guide her through a particularly dense cluster of people. And then he didn't move it. His hand stayed there, warm and steady, as they moved through the gallery. A claim. An intimacy. Margaret didn't pull away. They stood before a large abstract piece, blues and greens bleeding into each other like water and sky becoming one thing. It's beautiful, Margaret murmured. Yes, James said, but he was looking at her, not the painting. Their eyes met, held. The noise of the gallery faded. James's hand slipped from her back to her hand, fingers intertwining. Margaret, he said softly, I need to tell you something. Her heart hammered. Okay. Us, spending time together, it's become the best part of my week. The best part of my life, really. And I know we're friends, and I value that friendship more than I can say. But I need you to know that I have feelings for you. Real feelings. Romantic feelings. He squeezed her hand gently. You don't have to feel the same way. I just needed to be honest. You deserve honesty. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. Good tears. Happy tears. James, she whispered. I've been hoping you felt the same way. I've had feelings for you since, I don't even know when, but for a while now. His smile was radiant, relieved, joyful. Really? Really. They stood there holding hands in a crowded gallery, grinning at each other like teenagers. And Margaret felt something she'd thought David had killed forever. She felt wanted. She felt desired. She felt worthy of romance, passion, love, all the things she'd been told were no longer for her. And it felt like coming home. That night, lying in bed, Margaret should have felt nothing but joy. And she did feel joy, but she also felt fear. Because this was real now. This wasn't just friendship she could protect herself with. This was vulnerability. This was opening her heart again after it had been so thoroughly bruised. What if James changed his mind? What if he started seeing her flaws, her age, her ordinariness, and realized he'd made a mistake? What if she wasn't enough? David's voice crept back in, uninvited. I think we're both too old for that kind of love. But James's voice was there too, newer but stronger. They were wrong. Margaret got out of bed and went to the bathroom mirror. She looked at herself, really looked, and tried to see what James saw. She saw a woman who'd lived, who'd loved and lost and survived, who'd raised daughters and buried a husband and gotten up every morning anyway. She saw a woman who'd been told she was too old for love and had almost believed it. She saw a woman who was choosing, slowly, painfully, courageously, to believe something different. She thought about Linda's fierce words. The right person sees you. James saw her. He saw her awkward paintings and her nervous laugh and the way she overthought everything. He saw her at 52, exactly as she was, and he wanted her anyway. Not despite her age. Just wanted her. Margaret touched her reflection in the mirror. You are not too old, she whispered to herself. You are not too old for anything. She said it again, louder. You are not too old for love. The fear was still there. It would probably always be there. Some version of it. But so was something else now. Hope. Real hope. The kind built on genuine connection instead of desperate longing. James had feelings for her. And she had feelings for him. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Maybe that was everything. The next morning, Margaret woke to a text from James. I can't stop thinking about last night. About what we said. I want to take you on a real date. Dinner Friday? Just us, intentionally, as more than friends? Margaret stared at the message, her heart racing. This was it. The moment of decision. She could say no. Protect herself. Keep things safely in the friend zone where nothing could hurt her. Or she could say yes. Risk everything. Open her heart to the possibility of being hurt again. But also the possibility of being loved. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been 3 months ago. Broken. Defeated. Believing she was too old for this. She thought about the woman she was now. Painting. Laughing. Choosing herself. She typed her response. Yes, I would love that. Then, before she could overthink it, she added, James, I'm scared. I need you to know that. Someone hurt me badly. Made me believe terrible things about myself. So I'm scared. But I want to try anyway. With you. His response came immediately. I'm scared too, Margaret. My ex made me believe I wasn't enough. That I was boring and forgettable. So I understand being scared. But I think the best things happen when we're brave enough to try anyway. Then, let's be brave together. Margaret smiled through tears. Yes, she typed. Let's be brave together. And for the first time in 7 years, Margaret allowed herself to believe in the possibility of a future that included not just contentment or companionship, but real, honest, passionate love. She allowed herself to believe she deserved it. Because she did. Friday arrived with the gentle certainty of something inevitable and right. Margaret spent the afternoon in a state of nervous anticipation that felt wonderful instead of terrifying. She tried on 3 different outfits before settling on a simple blue dress. James had mentioned once that blue was his favorite color. When she answered the door at 7, James stood there holding flowers. Not roses this time, but wildflowers. Daisies and lavender and black-eyed Susans, cheerful and unpretentious. These reminded me of you, he said. beautiful and unpretentious and real. Margaret felt warmth spread through her chest. James took her to a small Italian restaurant on the edge of town. The kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles and wine bottles and no pretension whatsoever. They sat across from each other, and for the first few minutes there was awkwardness. The strange transition from friendship to something more. But then James said something self-deprecating about his terrible Italian accent, and Margaret laughed, and the awkwardness dissolved into the same easy comfort they'd always had, but with something new underneath. Intention. Romance. Possibility. They talked for 3 hours, about everything, about dreams they'd had as children. James wanted to be an artist. Margaret wanted to travel the world. About regrets. James wished he'd pursued art sooner. Margaret wished she'd traveled more before kids. About hopes for the future. "I'm thinking about retiring early," James admitted over tiramisu. "Maybe in 2 years. I want to travel, paint, actually live instead of just existing." "Where would you go?" Margaret asked. "Italy, definitely. France, maybe Greece." He paused. "Where would you want to go?" "I've always wanted to see Tuscany," Margaret said softly. "The rolling hills, the vineyards. I used to dream about painting there." "So let's go," James said, as if it was simple, as if they had a future where such things were possible. "Together?" Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. "Together," James confirmed. "Margaret, I know this is new. I know we're still figuring this out. But I want you to know that when I think about my future now, you're in it. If you want to be." Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "I want to be," she said, and she meant it with every cell in her body. They left the restaurant holding hands, and when James walked her to her door, he kissed her. Softly, sweetly, perfectly. Margaret's first kiss in 7 years, her first kiss at 52, and it was everything. 2 months into their relationship, James suggested they meet each other's families. "I want my son to meet you," he said during one of their Sunday morning painting sessions in Margaret's kitchen, a new tradition they'd started. "And I'd love to meet your daughters, if you're ready." Margaret felt a flutter of nerves. Her daughters knew she was seeing someone, but she'd been vague about details, not wanting to jinx anything. Emma and Sophie had been protective since Robert's death, skeptical of any man who showed interest in their mother. But she wanted them to meet James, wanted them to see how happy he made her. They planned a brunch at Margaret's house. Emma flew in from Seattle with her husband and the boys. Sophie drove up from Boston. James brought his son, Michael, who was 26 and worked in tech in the city. Margaret made quiche and fruit salad and cinnamon rolls. She was nervous, arranging and rearranging the table setting, until James came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "They're going to love you," she murmured. "I hope so," he said into her hair, "because I love their mother." It was the first time he'd said it. Margaret turned in his arms. "What?" James smiled, nervous but sure. "I love you, Margaret. I should have said it sooner, but I love you." "I love you too," Margaret whispered, tears in her eyes. They kissed, sweet and unhurried, until they heard car doors slamming outside. Brunch started awkwardly. Emma and Sophie were polite but reserved, studying James with the protective suspicion of daughters who'd watched their mother grieve for years. Michael was quiet, clearly unsure what to make of his father's new relationship. But then Margaret's youngest grandson, 4-year-old Thomas, spilled orange juice all over the table, and James immediately grabbed paper towels, joking with the boy about creating abstract juice art. Thomas giggled and declared James his new favorite person. Emma watched this exchange, and Margaret saw something in her daughter's expression soften. Over the meal, James talked easily with everyone. He asked Michael about his work, genuinely interested. He asked Emma about Seattle, about raising boys. He complimented Sophie on her physical therapy career, mentioning a patient he'd known who'd benefited from similar care. He was kind, genuine, present. After the meal, while James and Michael helped clean the kitchen, Emma pulled Margaret aside. Mom, he's wonderful. You think so? Margaret tried to keep the hope from her voice. I think he looks at you like you're everything, Emma said softly. The way Dad used to look at you. Maybe different, but just as real. I can see how happy you are. Sophie joined them, nodding. He's good, Mom. Really good. And you deserve good. Margaret felt tears threaten. You're sure? You don't think I'm being foolish? I'm 52 and… Mom, stop, Emma interrupted. Age has nothing to do with love. Dad would want you to be happy. We want you to be happy. And James clearly makes you happy. When everyone left that evening, James held Margaret on her porch. I think that went well, he said. Your son didn't say much. He told me in the kitchen that he hasn't seen me this happy in years, that you're good for me. James kissed her forehead. He's right. You are. Margaret leaned into him, feeling blessed beyond measure. Her daughters approved. His son approved. They had everyone's blessing to build a future together. 3 months into her relationship with James, Margaret ran into David at the grocery store. She was in the produce section, selecting tomatoes, when she heard her name. Margaret? Margaret Collins? She turned. David stood there with an empty cart, looking somehow smaller than she remembered. Tired. Older. David. Hi. She was surprised by how neutral she felt. No anger. No hurt. Just… nothing much at all. I haven't seen you at book club in months, he said. I've been meaning to text, but… well, how are you? I'm wonderful, actually, Margaret said truthfully. I've been busy, painting classes, spending time with friends. Life's been good. David nodded, looking at her strangely. You look really happy. Different. Glowing, almost. Margaret smiled. Thank you. I am happy. Are you… seeing someone? The question hung between them. Margaret could have deflected, could have said it was none of his business, but she found she wanted to tell him. Yes, actually. His name is James. We met at my art class. We've been together for 3 months now. David's expression flickered. Surprise, maybe disappointment, something Margaret couldn't quite read. That's wonderful, he said, but his voice sounded hollow. Really wonderful. I'm happy for you. Thank you. How are you? How's Emma? David's face fell slightly. We actually broke up about 6 weeks ago. It turned out… well, age differences are complicated. She wanted different things. Marriage, kids still. I thought I wanted to feel young again, but it turned out I just felt old trying to keep up. He laughed, but it sounded bitter. She made me realize that chasing youth doesn't make you young. It just makes you exhausted. Margaret felt a pang of sympathy. I'm sorry, David. That must have been difficult. It was my own fault. He looked at her directly. Margaret, I need to apologize. What I said to you last year about being too old for love, that was cruel and stupid and completely wrong. You look radiant. You clearly found exactly what you deserve. Margaret touched his arm gently. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate the apology. Does he make you happy, James? Very happy, Margaret said simply. He sees me, David. Really sees me. And he doesn't care about age or what society says we should or shouldn't feel at 50-something. He just loves me. David nodded slowly. You deserve that. I'm glad you found it. They parted warmly, and Margaret continued her shopping, feeling lighter. She'd needed that apology more than she'd realized. But more importantly, she'd realized something. She'd already forgiven him. Not for him. For herself. 6 months after their first date, on a quiet Sunday evening in Margaret's kitchen, James set down his paintbrush mid-stroke. Margaret looked up from her own canvas. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, James said. Everything's right. That's the problem. That's a problem? Margaret smiled, confused. James stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside her chair. Margaret's heart stopped. Margaret Collins, James said, his voice shaking slightly. I know we're not kids. I know people might say we're too old for grand gestures, that we should take things slow, that we should be practical. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. But I don't care what people say. I love you. I love painting with you and talking with you and waking up thinking about you. I love your laugh and your kindness and the way you see the world. I want to spend whatever time I have left on this earth with you. He opened the box, a simple gold band with a small diamond. Will you marry me? Margaret pulled him to his feet, tears streaming down her face, laughing and crying at once. Yes, she said. Yes, James. Yes. They kissed in her kitchen, surrounded by half-finished paintings and the life they were building together. And Margaret thought, this is what love is supposed to feel like. Not desperate, not fearful, just right. Margaret called Emma first, then Sophie, then Linda. All three women screamed with joy. Mom, oh my God, I'm so happy for you, Emma said, laughing through tears. When's the wedding? Can I be a bridesmaid? I'm absolutely being a bridesmaid, Sophie declared. Linda simply said, I told you so. I told you that man was an idiot and you deserved better. I'm so proud of you, Maggie. The next weekend, Emma and Sophie came home to help their mother shop for a wedding dress. They went to a boutique that specialized in mature brides, though Margaret hated that term. She tried on several dresses, white, ivory, cream. But nothing felt right until the consultant brought out a champagne-colored gown. Simple, elegant, with delicate lace sleeves and a flowing skirt. Margaret put it on and looked in the mirror. She didn't look young. She didn't look like a 25-year-old bride in a fairy tale. She looked like herself, a 53-year-old woman who'd lived and loved and survived and was choosing to love again. She looked beautiful. That's the one, Emma whispered. Definitely the one, Sophie agreed. Margaret bought the dress without hesitation. Later, over lunch, Sophie asked, Mom, are you nervous? About getting married again? Margaret considered the question. Not nervous about marrying James, but nervous about, I don't know, what people will think. I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm too old for this, that I'm being silly. Who cares what people think? Emma said fiercely. You're happy. James is wonderful. That's all that matters. Besides, Sophie added, you're not old. You're 53. That's young. You could have another 40 years together. 40 years. Margaret had never let herself imagine that. A whole lifetime still ahead. Not just surviving, but truly living. With James. With love. With partnership and painting and trips to Italy and Sunday mornings in the kitchen and everything. You're right, Margaret said, smiling through tears. I'm not too old for any of this. Damn right you're not, Linda would have said. And for the first time, Margaret believed it completely. One evening in late April, Margaret and James sat at her dining room table addressing wedding invitations. The wedding was planned for late June, a small, intimate ceremony in the botanical garden, followed by a reception in the garden's pavilion. 40 guests, family, close friends, their painting classmates. Margaret sealed another envelope and added it to the growing pile. Then she paused, pen hovering over the next invitation. An idea had been forming in her mind for weeks, an idea that felt equal parts graceful and satisfying. James, she said carefully, can I ask you something? Always. What would you think about inviting David to the wedding? James's hand stilled mid-address. He looked up. David, the man who told you that you were too old for love. Yes. The man who hurt you. Yes. Why? Margaret set down her pen and thought about how to explain. I've been thinking about it a lot. When he said those words to me, I almost believed them. I almost let them define the rest of my life. But I didn't. I found you instead. I found this. She gestured between them. I found proof that he was wrong. Okay, James said slowly. But that doesn't explain why you'd want him at our wedding. Because I want him to see, Margaret said simply. I want him to see that love doesn't have an age limit. I want him to witness what real love looks like. The kind built on respect and genuine connection, not on desperate attempts to feel young. And honestly, I think I've forgiven him enough that I genuinely want him to be happy. To learn what I learned, that we're not too old for anything. James was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled. You're a better person than I am, he said. If someone had told me I was too boring for love and then I found you, I'd want to rub it in their face. This isn't rubbing it in his face, Margaret said, though she couldn't help smiling a little. It's just living my truth and inviting him to witness it. And maybe, James added, grinning now, showing him exactly how wrong he was? Maybe a little bit of that, Margaret admitted. They both laughed. All right, James said. If you want to invite him, we'll invite him. I trust you. And honestly, I'd like to meet the man who was stupid enough to let you go. I want to shake his hand and thank him for being an idiot because his loss was my gain. Margaret loved him so much in that moment she could barely breathe. She pulled a fresh invitation from the stack and began to write. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with grace. With the quiet confidence of a woman who'd been told she was too old for love and had proved, beautifully, thoroughly, joyfully, that she was not. Margaret wrote the invitation by hand in her careful script. The printed part was standard. Margaret Collins and James Patterson request the honor of your presence at their wedding. But she added a personal note on heavy cardstock, slipping it inside the envelope with the formal invitation. Dear David, James and I are getting married on June 24th, and I would be honored if you would attend. I know our friendship ended awkwardly, and I want you to know that I hold no ill will. The path from that difficult evening to this joyful moment has taught me more about myself than I ever expected to learn. In a strange way, I'm grateful for everything that happened. You once told me that at my age I should accept companionship but let go of the idea of real romance. I understand why you said it. We're all afraid of aging, of becoming irrelevant, of missing our chance at happiness. But I've learned something important. There is no expiration date on love, on passion, on the possibility of starting over. James and I have found something real and beautiful, and I'd like to share that joy with you. Not to prove you wrong, though perhaps to prove wrong the fear that made you say those words in the first place. I hope you can celebrate this new chapter with us. With gratitude and genuine warmth, Margaret. She read it over twice, making sure the tone was right. Not bitter. Not triumphant in a cruel way. Just honest, graceful, true. She showed it to James. He read it slowly, then looked up at her with an expression of pure admiration. This is perfect, he said. You're handling this with so much grace. More than he deserves, honestly. Maybe, Margaret said. But I'm not doing this for him. I'm doing it for me. To prove to myself that I've truly moved past the hurt. That I've forgiven completely. James kissed her forehead. Then I'm proud of you. Margaret sealed the envelope, addressed it carefully, and added it to the pile of outgoing invitations. She felt lighter already. Whatever David's response, she'd done the right thing. The brave thing. She'd extended grace where she'd received hurt. And that, she thought, was its own kind of victory. Over the next 3 weeks, RSVPs arrived steadily. Emma and Sophie, obviously yes, thrilled to be bridesmaids. Linda and Thomas, yes. And Linda added a note. So proud of you, sis. You're going to be the most beautiful bride. Patricia from painting class, yes, and she'd love to read a poem during the ceremony if they wanted. James's son Michael, yes, honored to be best man. All their painting friends. Margaret's book club friends, minus David. James's colleagues, neighbors. Everyone they'd invited responded with joy and enthusiasm. Except David. 2 weeks passed. Then 3. Margaret tried not to obsess over it. Maybe he'd thrown away the invitation. Maybe he was too embarrassed to respond. Maybe he'd moved away and never received it. It didn't matter, she told herself. She'd extended the invitation. What he did with it was his choice. Then, exactly 2 weeks before the wedding, an RSVP card arrived in the mail. Margaret's hands shook as she opened it. David's handwriting. Yes, I'll attend. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored you thought to include me. Congratulations to you both. That was all. Simple, short. But he was coming. Margaret showed James that evening. How do you feel about it? He asked. Good, Margaret said, surprised to find it true. I feel good. I invited him because I wanted him to see that he was wrong. And now he will. He'll see how happy you are, James said, pulling her close. How loved, how cherished, how absolutely not too old for anything. Margaret smiled against his chest. Exactly. Margaret woke on her wedding day to sunlight streaming through her bedroom window. For a moment, she lay still, feeling the significance of the day settle over her like a warm blanket. Today, she was marrying James. Today, at 53 years old, she was starting over. Today, she was proving to herself and everyone else that it's never too late for love. Emma and Sophie arrived at 8 with coffee and pastries, laughing and crying already. They'd spent the night at a nearby hotel with the grandsons, wanting to give Margaret a peaceful last night alone before everything changed. How are you feeling, Mom? Emma asked, studying her mother's face. Happy, Margaret said simply. Really, genuinely happy. Linda arrived 30 minutes later with the flowers, white roses and lavender, simple and elegant. She'd also brought champagne, declaring that mimosas were mandatory for wedding mornings. They turned on music. Margaret's favorite oldies, songs from her youth. And the house filled with laughter and chatter as Margaret's daughters helped her prepare. Sophie did her hair, weaving small white flowers through the soft updo she created. Emma did her makeup, keeping it natural and glowing. Linda laid out the champagne-colored dress, making sure every detail was perfect. I can't believe my baby sister is getting married, Linda said, wiping tears. After everything you've been through. After almost giving up. Look at you now. Margaret looked at herself in the full-length mirror. The dress fit perfectly, elegant and age-appropriate and beautiful. Her hair was lovely. Her makeup was soft and natural. She wore her grandmother's pearl earrings and the simple gold necklace Robert had given her for their 10th anniversary. She looked like a bride. Not a young bride. Not a first-time bride. But a woman who'd earned every moment of joy this day would bring. A woman who'd survived loss and rejection and self-doubt. A woman who'd chosen to believe in love anyway. You look absolutely beautiful, Mom, Sophie whispered. Stunning, Emma agreed. James is going to cry when he sees you. Margaret smiled at her reflection. She saw every line, every gray hair, every mark of her 53 years. And she saw beauty. Real beauty. The kind that comes from surviving and thriving and refusing to give up. I'm ready, she said. Linda raised her mimosa glass. To Margaret, to second chances, to proving that love has no age limit. They all raised their glasses. To love, Margaret echoed. And in that moment, surrounded by the women who loved her most, Margaret felt a peace she'd never known. She'd made it. Through grief and hurt and fear, she'd made it to joy. The botanical garden was breathtaking. Late June had brought perfect weather. Sunny but not too hot, with a gentle breeze that made the flowers sway. The ceremony space had been set up in a grove of flowering trees, with white chairs arranged in a semicircle around a simple arch wrapped in roses and ivy. 40 guests sat waiting, murmuring quietly, smiling. Margaret waited with her daughters in a small preparation room off to the side, watching through the window as guests arrived. She saw James's colleagues from school, her book club friends, Patricia and the gang from painting class, all dressed up and beaming. And then she saw David. He arrived alone, looking uncomfortable in his suit, and took a seat near the back. He glanced around nervously, as if unsure he should be there. Margaret felt a flutter of satisfaction. Good. Let him be uncomfortable. Let him see what he'd dismissed so carelessly. But the thought came without malice. Just truth. The string quartet began playing, and Emma squeezed her mother's hand. Ready? Ready. Sophie went first, walking down the aisle in a lavender dress, smiling through tears. Then Emma, in the same lavender, blowing a kiss to her boys in the front row. And then it was Margaret's turn. She'd chosen to walk alone. Not because she didn't have someone to walk her down the aisle. Both daughters had offered, and Linda had volunteered to do it. But because she wanted to make this walk herself. She wanted to choose James, actively, consciously. She wanted to walk toward him on her own 2 feet, as an equal partner choosing partnership. The music shifted to the wedding march, and Margaret stepped into view. Every head turned, but Margaret only saw James. He stood at the altar in a navy suit, his son Michael beside him. And when he saw Margaret, his face transformed. Tears streamed down his cheeks. His smile was radiant. He mouthed, "Beautiful." Margaret walked down the aisle slowly, taking in every moment. The flowers, the sunshine, the faces of everyone she loved. And David. She saw him too, sitting near the back, watching with an expression she couldn't quite read. Regret? Maybe. Wonder. Recognition. But she didn't dwell on him. She walked toward James, toward her future, toward everything she'd almost believed was impossible. When she reached the altar, James took her hands. "Hi," he whispered. "Hi," she whispered back. The officiant began the ceremony, but Margaret barely heard the words. She was lost in James's eyes, in the feel of his hands holding hers, in the certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves. James promised to paint with her every Sunday, to travel to Italy, to love her exactly as she was, to never make her feel anything less than cherished. Margaret promised the same, to choose him every day, to build a life filled with art and laughter and adventure, to love him fully, fearlessly, forever. When the officiant said, "You may kiss your bride," James pulled her close and kissed her with a tenderness that made the guests sigh collectively. Margaret heard applause, but it sounded distant. All she felt was joy. Pure, uncomplicated, hard-earned joy. She was married, at 53, to a man who loved her completely. And it was perfect. The reception was held in the garden's pavilion, with long tables draped in white cloth and centerpieces of wildflowers. String lights had been hung overhead, creating a magical canopy of light. Margaret and James had their first dance to "At Last" by Etta James. James held her close, swaying slowly, whispering how happy he was, how lucky he felt, how much he loved her. Margaret rested her head on his shoulder and felt complete. After their dance, Emma and Sophie gave a joint toast that had everyone laughing and crying. Michael told embarrassing stories about his father that made James blush. Linda declared that her sister was proof that it's never too late for anything and dared anyone to disagree with her. The food was served, simple, delicious comfort food. The cake was cut, a small 2-tier confection with fresh flowers. Music played, people danced, children ran around the garden laughing. It was perfect, exactly what Margaret had wanted. And then, during a quiet moment when Margaret was catching her breath between dances, David approached her. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it. "Margaret," he said quietly, "thank you for inviting me." She turned to face him and saw that he looked emotional, vulnerable. "Thank you for coming, David." I need to apologize," he said, the words tumbling out. "What I said to you about being too old for love, it was cruel and stupid and so incredibly wrong. You look radiant today. You always deserved this. I was just too blind to see it." Margaret felt a warmth toward him that surprised her. Not romantic. Never that again. but genuine compassion. David, we all make mistakes. We all let fear make us say things we don't mean. I forgive you. I forgave you a long time ago. I don't deserve your forgiveness, David said, his voice thick. Maybe not, Margaret said gently. But I'm not giving it to you because you deserve it. I'm giving it to you because I deserve peace, and I have it now. She gestured around the reception, at James laughing with his son, at her daughters dancing with their families, at friends celebrating with joy. I have everything I need, David. I hope you find the same. Not with someone younger, not by chasing youth, but by accepting yourself exactly as you are and finding someone who does the same. David nodded, clearly struggling with emotion. He's a lucky man. I'm a lucky woman, Margaret corrected gently. They stood in silence for a moment, and then David excused himself. Margaret watched him leave shortly after, slipping away from the reception quietly. And she felt nothing but peace. Margaret returned to the dance floor where James was waiting with open arms. Everything okay? He asked as they swayed to a slow song. Everything's perfect, Margaret said truthfully. She looked around at her wedding, at the flowers and lights and people she loved, at her daughters dancing with their husbands, at her grandsons eating cake with chocolate all over their faces, at Linda laughing with Patricia, at James's son chatting with Emma, at James holding her like she was precious. Someone had once told her she was too old for love. This wedding, this perfect, joyful celebration, was her answer. Not spoken in anger or bitterness, but lived in truth. Lived in the courage to try again, to believe again, to love again. She was 53 years old, and she had never felt more alive, more seen, more loved, more herself. 2 days after the wedding, Margaret and James flew to Italy. Tuscany, specifically. The rolling hills and vineyards Margaret had dreamed about for years. The place she'd mentioned casually at their first official date, not really believing she'd ever go. They rented a small villa outside of Siena, a converted farmhouse with terracotta tiles and windows that opened onto views of endless green hills dotted with cypress trees. It was magical. They spent their days slowly, luxuriously. Mornings, they'd sit on the terrace with coffee and fresh bread, watching the sunrise paint the hills gold. Then they'd drive to nearby towns, Montepulciano, San Gimignano, Montalcino, walking cobblestone streets, visiting churches and markets, eating pasta and drinking wine. They took their Italian lessons seriously, attempting conversations with locals who smiled warmly at their terrible pronunciation and helped them anyway. Margaret learned to order food in Italian. James learned to ask for directions, though they got lost anyway, laughing at their inability to read maps. They painted. Of course they painted. They'd pack up their supplies and find spots in the countryside, under olive trees, beside vineyards, on hillsides overlooking medieval towns, and spend hours capturing the light, the colors, the impossible beauty of it all. Their paintings were still mediocre at best, but that wasn't the point. The point was being there. Together, creating something, living a dream that Margaret had almost convinced herself was impossible. One afternoon, sitting on a hillside with watercolors scattered around them, James set down his brush and just looked at Margaret. "What?" she asked, laughing self-consciously. "I'm just happy," he said simply. "I didn't think I could be this happy again. After Sharon, after feeling like my life was half over, I didn't think this." He gestured around them. "I didn't think I'd get this." Margaret set down her own brush and moved closer to him. "Me neither," she whispered. "I thought I was done. Too old for adventure, for romance, for everything. And now look at us." They kissed, soft and sweet, with Tuscan sunshine warm on their faces and the smell of wild lavender in the air. That night, they made love in their villa with the windows open, moonlight streaming in, and Margaret felt desired in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with genuine connection. James loved her body. 53-year-old body with its softness and scars and years written across it. He loved her exactly as she was, and she loved him the same way. The next morning, Margaret sent postcards to her daughters, to Linda, to her grandsons. She even sent one to David. "Wish you well," she wrote simply. "Life is beautiful. I hope you find your version of this happiness." And she meant it, because she'd learned something profound. Happiness isn't scarce. Love isn't limited. Joy doesn't run out when you share it. There was enough for everyone, even for the people who'd hurt her, especially for herself. 2 days after the wedding, Margaret and James flew to Italy. Tuscany, specifically. The rolling hills and vineyards Margaret had dreamed about for years. The place she'd mentioned casually at their first official date, not really believing she'd ever go. They rented a small villa outside of Siena, a converted farmhouse with terracotta tiles and windows that opened onto views of endless green hills dotted with cypress trees. It was magical. They spent their days slowly, luxuriously. Mornings, they'd sit on the terrace with coffee and fresh bread, watching the sunrise paint the hills gold. Then they'd drive to nearby towns, Montepulciano, San Gimignano, Montalcino, walking cobblestone streets, visiting churches and markets, eating pasta and drinking wine. They took their Italian lessons seriously, attempting conversations with locals who smiled warmly at their terrible pronunciation and helped them anyway. Margaret learned to order food in Italian. James learned to ask for directions, though they got lost anyway, laughing at their inability to read maps. They painted. Of course they painted. They'd pack up their supplies and find spots in the countryside, under olive trees, beside vineyards, on hillsides overlooking medieval towns, and spend hours capturing the light, the colors, the impossible beauty of it all. Their paintings were still mediocre at best, but that wasn't the point. The point was being there. Together. Creating something. Living a dream that Margaret had almost convinced herself was impossible. One afternoon, sitting on a hillside with watercolors scattered around them, James set down his brush and just looked at Margaret. "What?" she asked, laughing self-consciously. "I'm just happy," he said simply. "I didn't think I could be this happy again. After Sharon, after feeling like my life was half over, I didn't think this." He gestured around them. "I didn't think I'd get this." Margaret set down her own brush and moved closer to him. "Me neither," she whispered. "I thought I was done. Too old for adventure, for romance, for everything. And now look at us." They kissed, soft and sweet, with Tuscan sunshine warm on their faces and the smell of wild lavender in the air. That night, they made love in their villa with the windows open, moonlight streaming in, and Margaret felt desired in a way that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with genuine connection. James loved her body. 53-year-old body with its softness and scars and years written across it. He loved her exactly as she was, and she loved him the same way. The next morning, Margaret sent postcards to her daughters, to Linda, to her grandsons. She even sent one to David. "Wish you well," she wrote simply. "Life is beautiful. I hope you find your version of this happiness." And she meant it, because she'd learned something profound. Happiness isn't scarce. Love isn't limited. Joy doesn't run out when you share it. There was enough for everyone, even for the people who'd hurt her, especially for herself. They returned home 2 weeks later, tanned and happy and reluctant to leave Italy but excited to start their real life together. James moved into Margaret's house officially, bringing his books and paintings and his beloved but dying houseplants. They rearranged furniture, combining their lives in ways both practical and symbolic. They converted the spare bedroom into a shared art studio, setting up 2 easels side by side, organizing their supplies, creating a space that was theirs together. Sunday morning painting became sacred. No matter what else was happening, they'd spend Sunday mornings in their studio, working side by side in comfortable silence or easy conversation, creating art that would never hang in museums but filled their lives with color. Margaret returned to teaching part-time at the community center, children's art classes that filled her with purpose and joy. She loved watching kids discover creativity, loved seeing their confidence grow as they learned to express themselves. James began planning his early retirement. 2 more years teaching, and then he'd be free to travel, to paint, to consult part-time if he wanted extra money, but mostly to just live. They hosted dinners for their combined families. Emma and Sophie's families visited more often now, staying weekends, filling the house with children's laughter again. Michael came for Sunday brunches, and Margaret loved watching him and James reconnect, their relationship healing in ways Margaret's presence had somehow facilitated. They adopted a golden retriever puppy from the local shelter. James wanted to name him Rembrandt. Margaret countered with Monet. They compromised. His full name was Rembrandt Monet Patterson Collins, but they called him Monet for short. The dog was ridiculous, clumsy and enthusiastic, and constantly stealing paintbrushes. They loved him desperately. Life wasn't perfect. Margaret and James had disagreements sometimes, about whose turn it was to do dishes, about whether to get a new couch, about silly things that didn't matter. James left his shoes in walkways. Margaret was terrible about checking her phone. He snored sometimes. She hogged the blankets. But these weren't deal breakers. They were just life, real life, partnership, the kind of mundane, ordinary challenges that come with sharing space and breath and days with another person. And Margaret had never been happier, because this was what she'd wanted all along. Not perfection, not youth recaptured, not some fantasy of romance without conflict, just genuine partnership, respect, love that chose to stay even when things were hard. Love that saw her completely, flaws in age and ordinary humanity, and stayed anyway. Love that said, "You are enough exactly as you are." That was everything. That was more than enough. That evening, Margaret sat with James on their back porch. They'd built a small deck that summer, adding comfortable chairs and hanging lights. It had become their evening ritual, sitting together as the sun set, Monet at their feet, talking about their days or sitting in comfortable silence. "What are you thinking about?" James asked, reaching for her hand. "How grateful I am," Margaret said softly. "For everything. Even for David telling me I was too old for love." James raised his eyebrows. "Really?" "Really," Margaret confirmed. "Because if he hadn't said it, I might never have hit bottom. I might never have been forced to confront my own fears about aging. I might never have chosen myself, joined that art class, met you." She squeezed his hand. "Everything that hurt led me here, to this porch, with this man, with this life. And I wouldn't change any of it." James kissed her temple. "I'm glad someone was stupid enough to let you go, because their loss was definitely my gain." Margaret smiled, watching fireflies begin to dance across their garden. She was 53 years old, and her life had never been more beautiful. A year after her wedding, Margaret started volunteering at a women's support group for divorcees and widows over 50. Linda had suggested it, knowing her sister had wisdom worth sharing. At first, Margaret had been hesitant. Who was she to give advice? But then she realized she'd been exactly where these women were. Lost, believing lies about their worth, convinced their time had passed. If she could help even one woman believe differently, it was worth it. The group met every Thursday evening at the community center. 12 to 15 women usually attended, some in their 50s, some in their 60s, a few in their 70s, all struggling with loneliness, invisibility, fear about the future. Margaret shared her story, not as a lecture, not as someone who had all the answers, but as a fellow traveler who'd walked a hard road and found her way to the other side. She told them about David, about the words that had nearly destroyed her, about the night she'd believed she was too old for love, too old for passion, too old for anything that mattered. She told them about the choice she'd made, to believe something different, to choose herself, to try anyway. She told them about James, about their slow-building friendship that became romance, about their wedding, about building a life based on genuine connection instead of desperate attempts to recapture youth. And most importantly, she told them, "You are not too old. You are not too anything. Love doesn't check your birth certificate. Passion doesn't have an expiration date. Adventure doesn't end at 50 or 60 or 70. The only thing that can stop you from living fully is believing you're not allowed to anymore." The women listened, some crying, some nodding, some looking skeptical but hopeful. After each session, women would approach Margaret privately. One woman, 62, said she'd been alone for 15 years and had convinced herself she'd never date again. But Margaret's story made her think maybe she should try. Another, 57, said she'd been turning down a colleague who'd asked her out repeatedly because she felt too old, too heavy, too undesirable. But maybe she'd say yes next time he asked. A third, 70, said she didn't need romance but had been afraid to travel alone, to take risks, to live boldly. Margaret's words made her book a solo trip to Greece she'd been dreaming about for years. These conversations filled Margaret with purpose. She couldn't save everyone, couldn't undo every hurt or erase every insecurity. But she could share her truth. She could stand as living proof that it's never too late to start over, to choose joy, to refuse to accept society's limitations on aging women. She could be the voice she'd needed when David's words had crushed her. The voice that said, "You are enough. You are worthy. You are not too old for anything." And if even one woman believed it, everything Margaret had been through was worth it. Over the months, Margaret received letters. Women from the support group, writing to share updates, to say thank you, to tell her how their lives had changed. One letter came from Susan, 62, who'd been widowed for 15 years. "Dear Margaret, I wanted you to know that I started dating again. His name is Robert, coincidentally, and we met at a concert. I almost didn't go. Thought I was too old for live music crowds. But I remembered what you said about not being too old for anything. Robert is wonderful. We're taking things slow, but I'm happy. Really happy. Thank you for giving me permission to try." Another from Patricia, 57. "Margaret, you were right. I said yes when Daniel asked me out again. We've been dating for 3 months now, and it's lovely. Not wild or crazy, just comfortable and real and good. He's 59, divorced, and he thinks I'm beautiful. Imagine that. Thank you for helping me believe I deserve this." One from Eleanor, 70. "I went to Greece, solo, for 2 weeks. It was terrifying and magnificent, and I felt so alive. I hiked ruins and swam in the Mediterranean and ate amazing food and talked to strangers. I even met a lovely man named Stavros who took me dancing one night. Nothing came of it romantically, but it reminded me that I'm still a vibrant woman with desires and dreams. Age is just a number. Thank you for helping me remember." Not all the letters were about romance. Some were about women starting businesses, going back to school, taking up hobbies, rekindling friendships, traveling alone, learning new skills. All of them were about women choosing to live fully instead of accepting society's message that their time had passed. Margaret kept every letter in a beautiful box Linda had given her. On days when she doubted herself, when old insecurities crept in, she'd read through them and remember. Her story mattered. Her pain had purpose. Her choice to try again, to love again, to believe again. It had rippled outward, touching lives she might never meet, changing stories she'd never hear. She'd been told she was too old for love, and by proving that wrong, she'd helped countless other women believe they weren't too old either. For anything. Ever. 2 years after their wedding, on a quiet Sunday morning in early autumn, Margaret and James sat in their studio painting. Sunlight poured through the windows, making the colors on their palettes glow. Monet slept at their feet, now a dignified 2-year-old instead of a chaotic puppy. Classical music played softly from the speaker. They'd painted the same scene dozens of times. The view from their window of the garden Margaret tended, the trees changing with seasons, the light shifting with the hours. But it never got old. never felt repetitive. Because painting, Margaret had learned, wasn't about the final product. It was about the process, the meditation, the time spent creating alongside someone you loved. James worked on a landscape, trees in autumn colors, all golds and crimsons. Margaret was attempting portraits now, practicing faces, trying to capture emotion in watercolor's unpredictable flow. She was painting James, his profile, concentration on his face as he worked, the gentle lines around his eyes, the silver in his hair catching light. She wanted to capture what she saw when she looked at him. Not youth, but something better. Wisdom, kindness, love that had survived loss and chose to try again, beauty that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with character. "Can I see?" James asked, setting down his brush. Margaret showed him. He studied it for a long moment, then smiled. "That's how you see me?" "That's who you are," Margaret corrected. James pulled her close, kissing her softly. "I love you. I love you too." They returned to their work, comfortable in their silence, in their routine, in their life together. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been 3 years ago. Broken, defeated, believing she was too old for this kind of happiness. She thought about David's words, which had once devastated her and now seemed almost absurd in their wrongness. She thought about all the women she'd helped, all the lives touched by her choice to believe differently. And she thought about this moment. Sunday morning, painting with her husband, dog at their feet, whole life ahead of them. She was 55 years old, and she had never felt younger in spirit, more alive in purpose, more certain of her worth. Age was just a number. Love was eternal. And she was living proof. Margaret set down her brush and looked at James, who looked back and smiled without needing to ask why. Some truths didn't need words, but some truths needed to be spoken, again and again, until everyone believed them. You are never too old to start over. You are never too old to hope again. You are never too old to love again. The invitation Margaret sent to her wedding wasn't just for David. It was for every voice that had ever told her, told anyone, that their time had passed. That passion belonged to the young. That romance had an age limit. That dreams expired. The wedding itself, the life she built afterward, was her answer. Not spoken in anger or bitterness or need for revenge, but lived in truth, in courage, in the quiet confidence of a woman who refused to accept someone else's limitations. Love doesn't age. People do. And every age deserves to be loved. Every age deserves to dream. Every age deserves to live fully, boldly, joyfully. Margaret had been told she was too old for love, so she'd invited him to her wedding. And in doing so, she'd proved, beautifully, thoroughly, undeniably, that some people are just too small to see the truth. It's never too late for anything. Ever. And there, dear friend, is where Margaret's story brings us. Not to an ending, really, because her life continues, filled with painting and love and Sunday mornings and trips to Italy and grandchildren and friends and all the beautiful, ordinary moments that make a life rich. But to an understanding, a truth we can carry with us. Margaret was told she was too old for love. She almost believed it. She almost let those words define the rest of her life. But she didn't. She chose differently. She chose to try. She chose herself. She chose to believe that passion and romance and love don't come with expiration dates stamped on them by people who are afraid of their own aging. And in choosing that, she found James. She found joy. She found purpose. She found proof that everything she'd been told was a lie. More than that, she helped other women find the same truth. Her story rippled outward, touching lives, changing narratives, giving permission to women who'd been taught to shrink, to settle, to accept that their time had passed. But here's what I want you to understand, what I need you to hear. This isn't just Margaret's story. This is your story too, if you need it to be. If you've ever been told you're too old, for love, for dreams, for adventure, for passion, for anything, Please know, they were wrong. If you've ever looked in the mirror and seen only age instead of the beautiful accumulation of years lived and survived, please know, you're looking with the wrong eyes. If you've ever felt invisible, dismissed, past your prime, please know, your prime is whenever you say it is. Age is just a number. It's not a sentence. It's not a limitation. It's not an ending. It's just information. How long you've been alive, how many years you've survived, how much wisdom you've gathered, everything else. Your worth, your desirability, your right to passion and love and joy. None of that has an expiration date. None of it. Margaret invited David to her wedding not out of spite, but out of grace. She wanted him to see what he'd missed, to witness the truth he'd been too afraid to believe. But more than that, she wanted to prove it to herself, that she'd healed, that she'd moved forward, that those words that once crushed her had become nothing more than background noise to the beautiful life she'd built. So, if you're listening to this and you're 50, 60, 70, 80, if you're any age at all and you've been told you're too old for something you desire, I want you to do something for me. I want you to remember Margaret. Remember that she was 52 and broken and believing lies about herself. Remember that she chose to try anyway. Remember that she found love? Yes. But more importantly, she found herself again. And I want you to know, you can too. It's not too late for you. It's never too late. Your story isn't over. You're still writing it, every day with every choice you make. Choose yourself. Choose hope. Choose to believe that you deserve every good thing at every age. Choose to live fully instead of accepting the limitations others try to place on you. Choose to be brave. And if someone tells you you're too old, smile and invite them to watch what happens next, because you're about to prove them spectacularly wrong. Thank you for listening to Margaret's story. I hope it touched something in you. I hope it changed something. I hope it gave you permission to believe that you too are worthy of everything beautiful this life has to offer. At any age. Always. Now go live that truth. The world is waiting for your story.